States, the Great Reset will have short-term impacts on perceptions and policies here and abroad. The battle over real borders, fair trade, personal responsibility, low taxes, minimal regulation, public safety, and freedom of expression will intensify. As in 2009 to 2010, the left will have the upper hand administratively, but it will be on the defensive electorally. The battle for a new social contract will intensify, but little progress will be made.
Trend number 2, the Creative Society, Lessons from Operation Warp Speed. In 1967, Ronald Reagan delivered his first inaugural message as governor of California. The title of his remarks was, The Creative Society. He meant to contrast his approach with the big government methods of Lyndon Johnson's then current Great Society dystopia. Reagan's principles were straightforward. The path ahead is not an easy one. It demands much of those chosen to govern, but also from those who did the choosing. And let there be no mistake about this. We have come to a crossroad, a time of decision, and the path we follow turns away from any idea that government and those who serve it are omnipotent. It is a path impossible to follow unless we have faith in the collective wisdom and genius of the people. And along this path, government will lead, but not rule, and listen, but not lecture. This is the path of the Creative Society. To quote Reagan, government has a legitimate role, a most important role in taking the lead in mobilizing the full and voluntary resources of the people. 14 years later, Reagan would echo this sentiment in his first inaugural address as president, saying, "Now, so there will be no misunderstanding. It is not my intention to do away with government. It is, rather, to make it work with us, not over us, to stand by our side, not ride on our back." In 2020, we witnessed what amounts to the best illustration of the Reagan Creative Society seen so far in the 21st century. It was called Operation Warp Speed, and it devoted the resources of the U.S. government to aiding private companies in the design, testing, and distribution of an effective vaccination for COVID-19. The deadline? 1 year after the virus's appearance in Wuhan, China. And to the surprise of bureaucrats and naysayers everywhere, it worked. The FDA granted emergency use authorization to Pfizer in December, and the first shots were administered to frontline healthcare workers before New Year's. Later in the month, the FDA voted 20-0 to authorize Moderna's vaccine. At that point, the end of the pandemic came into sight, and that's probably the biggest factor that drove America's year-end stock market surge. Importantly, Pfizer's coronavirus vaccine showed 90% efficacy in preventing COVID-19. Moderna announced theirs is nearly 95% effective. And AstraZeneca's vaccine is somewhere between 62% and 90% effective. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration dictates that vaccines be at least 50% effective to earn emergency use authorization. So, most observers weren't expecting vaccine candidates to be much more than 50% effective. Unlike so many government initiatives, Operation Warp Speed was not about a one-size-fits-all bureaucratic solution. It was about government assisting and facilitating private companies to best leverage their own resources. As a result, the government played different roles with different vaccine innovators. Pfizer stayed somewhat aloof from Operation Warp Speed. After reporting results from its vaccine trials, A company spokesperson was quick to point out that Pfizer did not actually receive research funding from the program, but it did call on the government a couple of times, and it contracted to sell 100 million doses of its vaccine to the United States long before clinical trials were completed. Moderna, by contrast, worked closely with the U.S. government. Nearly $2.5 billion in federal funds helped Moderna buy raw materials, expand its factory, and enlarge its workforce by 50%. In return, it agreed to deliver 100 million doses to the federal government. The government also helped with crisis management. For instance, when Moderna discovered this summer that an air handling unit for its factory could not be delivered over a weekend because of COVID-19 limitations on interstate trucking, a Defense Department official stepped in. And Operation Warp Speed officials arranged a law enforcement escort to accompany the massive piece of equipment from the Midwest to Moderna's Massachusetts manufacturing plant. This and similar anecdotes demonstrate that no logistical or regulatory obstacle was permitted to stand in the way of a life-saving vaccine. In late March, bureaucratic delays and mismanagement ruined the government's ability to track the pandemic at an early stage. As the deadly virus spread from China with ferocity across the United States between late January and early March, they wrote, large-scale testing of people who might have been infected did not happen because of technical flaws, regulatory hurdles, business-as-usual bureaucracies, and lack of leadership at multiple levels. The Centers for Disease Control insisted that it coordinate national testing and community surveillance. Disaster ensued when the CDC's test was revealed as flawed. The FDA, no better. According to the Times, it enforced regulations that paradoxically made it tougher for hospitals, private clinics, and companies to deploy